Well, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and returning to the show. It has been a while. Chris Trapasso, CBS Sports draft analyst. Chris, we just use you up and throw you out after draft season. That's just how it is. But you know what? We got to keep checking in. What is going on, man? How are you?
I'm doing really good, and this is not quite the start of the religious weekly podcast from January to April, but this is the next best thing. Like I certainly love coming on at that time of the year to talk about all these kind of unknowns, but it's actually more fun in a way right now, or it's fun in its own way because now Vikings fans have read about this rookie class, know what they have in the 2022 group. So when I'm bringing up names and bringing up evaluations, people aren't like, "Who's that guy from that college?" So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this episode, and just this is a fun time of year for me to get those first couple looks at players that I've watched over the last couple of years or the last couple of months for the rookies, just their first time on an NFL field. Yes, it's just the preseason, but it's better than just speculating about how good they're going to be, which is pretty much all I do during draft season.
Yeah, and you actually start to get a sample size of players in the
Yep.
preseason. And I was joking the other day on the show that, of course, I'm going to cover every inch of a Vikings preseason game, but you would be
Hmm.
hard pressed to make me watch other preseason games.
Yeah.
You, on the other hand, have to watch all of the preseason action. So I've got other players outside of the Vikings to ask you about as well in some of your evaluations. But there has been
Hmm.
so much discussion during Vikings camp about the 2022 versus 2023 the draft classes and just the stark difference about how everyone is doing. So I think the fundamental question that it comes down to with 2022 is how long should we give everyone? Because it is not really rolling along, except for a Caleb Evans starting at outside corner for the
Hmm.
2022 class. But I'm curious about what you think about where Lewis Cine stands so far, because we kind of put a date on it. Like, hey, if we get to the joint practices and he hasn't taken a single first team rep, then there's a little bit of concern there. And guess what? The joint practices are here and he hasn't taken a single first team rep. Still, though, he had a major injury last year. It's not like his career is over today. Where do you stand on Lewis Cine, the patience, and what might be getting in the way of him taking the next step?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I feel like we kind of broached this subject during the draft season or maybe right afterward about Lewisine and could he kind of be that, extra draft pick, so to speak, because he played so little last year. But with him and even with Andrew Booth, who did get beat for that touchdown in the preseason game, Jake Bobo of the Seahawks, I think you can have a little bit more of a leash, probably pretty deep into their second season because they just did not really play that much if at all, last year. The one thing I'll say, and I'm not like trying to sound the alarm in Vikings land, watching the film from that Seahawks preseason game, it did not look like to me, and I'm interested to hear what you've seen at camp, that Cine had the same level of explosiveness that I saw on film at Georgia. That change of direction ability where he could stop and then explode in a different direction. I remember we talked about it. You mentioned that, in that little post draft evaluation session that the Viking staff did with you guys in the media there, the local media, that we kind of agreed that Lewis Cine had the twitch of a nickel corner, but he was big, 6 foot, over 200 pounds at the safety spot. It didn't look like, I don't know if he doesn't trust his leg yet, or hopefully not for him, that he's lost some of his just acceleration ability from that injury. So I think that's probably why we haven't seen him play to the level of where the Vikings expected him to be. Just didn't look as explosive, moving around, and certainly changing directions is a key component to playing the safety position.
Especially in the run game, he was not coming
Yeah,
downhill with
no.
aggression. I thought that was quite clear
And
when I
that
look
was
back
his
at the
strength
game.
at Georgia. When he would see an outside run, it was a lightning bolt to the football. And you're like, man, from Georgia, pretty solid tackler, big. That was like one of the certain positives that I feel like not only me but anyone else evaluating him saw. I didn't see that in that Seahawks preseason game.
And this is what I'm interested in because the transition from college to the NFL, this is your life. This is what you study. And there are many instances of guys that you watched in college that they did certain things, and then in the NFL, you go, "Where was it?" And I think that
Mhm.
one of the reasons is because of how complicated the NFL is, how much you're having to assess and analyze and think at the same time is way, way different than college football. And there's no real way to decide. And you know this for many years of trying to evaluate prospects, there's no real way to decide, oh, well, he does this in college, so that will definitely translate to the X's and O's and how fast you read stuff and how quickly things happen in the NFL. At the same time, I do want to give some leeway to the idea that the injury would have been very traumatic for him. And it was his first time back on a football field. But we also didn't really see it in training camp or preseason last year. So I guess I'm swinging back and forth weighing these things. But I do feel like this is a very different looking player from the guy that you and I studied as soon as he came out from Georgia.
Yeah, definitely. And I think to kind of stretch out that point a little further, that's kind of why we hear sometimes coaches in press conferences around this time of year, or even early into a regular season when they're talking about, especially rookies, that they're not really playing fast. That doesn't mean that, like, Lewis Cine can't run as fast as he did in the 40-yard dash coming out of Georgia. It's just everything's happening faster around them than even in the SEC. And there's so many more job responsibilities and checks. And hey, if this guy's here, I need to be there, where they're thinking a little bit too much. So maybe that could be the case too for Lewis Cine. And that's why I think, back to my previous answer before, that we should give more leeway to him and Andrew Booth, because they didn't get that, learning on the fly experience of, hey, I can't just play truly as fast as I am like I did in college at Clemson and Georgia, because I need to understand it's so much more mental and I'm thinking a lot more. So that, hopefully for Lewis Cine's case, is why he's not changing directions as rapidly, because he's kind of pressing and he's trying to process a lot quicker, and it's a little bit more confusing in this defense than what he was really accustomed to at Georgia.
Now, during draft season, you and I talk about this all the time. It's one of our biggest topics, one of the most fun things, because we're always reassessing this and trying to come up with new ideas, is how to grade and how to judge draft picks. And naturally, with this one, and this is kind of a whole 2022 draft class thing, but with Lewis Cine, he's really the swingman to this class. If he's good, then the class is fine. Even if there's a couple busts, there are always a couple of busts, but you really were looking for him to shape the secondary going forward
Mm-hmm.
in the future and be
Yep.
that big time playmaker that he hasn't been so far. But I want you to go back and think to the Lewis Cine analysis that you had coming out. Did it make sense in your mind? Because I didn't go back and listen to our podcast. Did it make sense to draft Lewis Cine? Now we know about the trade down. I don't think anyone really loved the trade down, except for
Mm-hmm.
some people who create analytics charts said maybe it was okay, but by history speaking, usually the other team has to give up a first. That didn't happen, so I think that's fair to second guess that part. But it really hinges on the player, because if he becomes good, then the trade looks so much better. So is it a second guessable draft pick from the outset, or is it really just the result was not what they were looking for?
I think you can second guess it a little bit, because I guess there's kind of a debate among draft analysts. How valuable is the safety position? I know it, obviously that pick came late, and you obviously, like you mentioned, have to factor in the trade down. Some people that are in my industry think that safety is super valuable, because it's a position where there's not necessarily free and strong safeties anymore. A lot of them play nickel. They're slot defenders, is kind of like the new term that we've used over the last really only like 2 to 3 years. So they have to do so many different things. Teams are obviously passing the football a lot more than they used to. Then there's the other school of thought, and this is a little bit of where I lean. For as much as I think, I'm not saying they're not valuable, but when you're looking at the first round of a draft, there's a lot of other positions, and I feel like I use this term all the time with you. It doesn't really move the needle as much as offensive linemen or receivers or edge rushers or even defensive tackles that can penetrate and get upfield. So from that perspective, I think you could say, hey, like, they had Harrison Smith. They knew he wasn't close to retiring. He's been there now for 2 years with Lewis Cine. The only way that I would say, regardless of the results, that you shouldn't second guess it is that, and I feel like we did talk about this as well during draft season, but as a refresher, it seems like this new regime wants those younger players with the mentors. There was Patrick Peterson last season with some of the young corners. Obviously, Andrew Booth didn't get to play a ton. I think they like to have that mentor and mentee relationship. Lewis Cine learning from Harrison Smith, who was a big, physical, very athletic, do everything safety coming out of Notre Dame. That was probably something that was baked into them making that pick after the trade back.
But as a prospect, now I was going back to look because I remember with the Laquan Treadwell stuff that Laquan Treadwell was a pretty hotly debated prospect, but there were a
Mhm.
lot of people in the analysis world who loved him. And again, once someone goes bust, you can never convince anybody that it was that the pick made sense because it went bust. But with
Mhm.
Treadwell, look at the other receivers in the class. There's a bunch of busts in that class, and he had great college stats, and on and on and on and on, right? And I guess
He
I
was
wonder
young
about
too. Yeah.
and I wonder about Lewis Cine with that because I looked at Lance Zierlein, NFL.com. He was not in love with Lewis Cine. He actually compared him to an Anthony Harris, which I thought if you're drafting Anthony Harris
Interesting.
as a first rounder, that's probably not where you want to go. But there were other people who had him much higher. And the consensus board, I think on what is it, draft breakdown or whatever it is, mock draft breakdown, had it as like 34th. So right in the area that he was taken. All of this matters to me. It doesn't matter like on the field because if he's not good, he's not good. But it does matter when we're looking back and we're taking the accumulation of a small sample size of a new general manager to say, should we be kind of looking back at that and going, what were you doing there, bro? Or is it like this was a good prospect and it just hasn't clicked yet and we need to give it some time?
Well, I think I would start with the former with that because it was kind of multi-layered. Like you're sitting there, you can pick your player, and oh, you're going to trade back with the Lions in your division. And most of the draft boards, in terms of the trade charts, were like, they didn't really get great value. And then you pick a safety that, like you're mentioning, was not this like slam dunk, like, oh my God, they're getting Derwin James level prospect. And I'm willing to admit, like, maybe I was a little bit off on him. I had him as my 25 overall player. So it's not like I thought that was you know, really a reach at all, but I do know, like you mentioned, there were others in the industry that were, thought, early second, but even at that point, I think most people weren't like, whoa, this is like a name out of nowhere, but it was not a slam dunk type, player that they felt they could get later in the first round. So because of those two layers, and you factor in the NFC North, and then a year later, there's so much hype coming out of Detroit with what they've been able to do. Not that Jameson Williams has necessarily turned out, but the trade back has been kind of a controversial one. So to have it be multi-layered and then have Lewisine get hurt and then not necessarily even be playing with the first team very close to the regular season, I think you can kind of second guess it because of all those dynamics that were at play.
And the fact that Kyle Hamilton is just good. And if you wanted a safety and a
Yeah.
dynamic weapon, maybe
And
just
he
take
was
him
a slam
and
dunk
yeah.
guy. He was a slam dunk guy. He was the everyone loved him. He's a freaky athlete. He was at Notre Dame, was good for multiple seasons. So that's what was kind of head scratching about it as well.
So I think with this one, yeah, when you add up all the accumulation of factors, it is fair. But I would also hold out for if suddenly next year Lewis Cine has it all click and is good, then it ends up being justified. And so I would put it at trending very poorly, but could also turn around and would not be the first guy in his third year to finally have it click in.
Yeah, one more thing on this that I want to ask you: have the Vikings or Lewisine himself spoke about his? Is he not super aggressive or doesn't feel the confidence in his lower half? Because I think at times today we think, oh, ACL injury, you're back in 7-8 months, you're fine, you're young. I always kind of blend in some of my Bill stuff here. Tre'Davious White tore his ACL Thanksgiving 2021. He didn't play again until Thanksgiving 2022, and it was a slow process. Like he wasn't really back to 100% in really until almost January, the Bills playoffs when they started last season. So I think, yes, the vast majority of these insanely, top 1% of 1% athletes, especially in their early 20s, usually come back within 9 months from, even very serious Achilles and ACLs and PCLs. But I don't think that's the case. It's not 100% guaranteed for every single player in the NFL.
And so there hasn't been any connecting those two. It's
Okay.
been a lot of sort of, well, Lewis this year is acting a little more professionally, which makes you go,
Mm,
so wait, last year then there was like he's learning to be a pro, we hear, and like, oh, okay, I kind of get what you're saying. Some guys pick up on that earlier than others, but what happens if you don't pick up on it right away, which is how to study, how to pay attention in meetings, how to, pay attention to your body and all those things, somebody else takes your job. And that's what's
yeah.
happened with Cam Bynum, who has become a reasonable player. So that all factors in. He was there for OTAs, mini camp, training camp. Like, I don't know if I can really put that excuse out there, but I would say that it was a catastrophic injury. So
Yeah.
there's also, there's really no way of knowing how much it's impacting him. I would guess that it probably is in his first game action, but
Hmm.
you can't kind of erase what you knew before. So the rest of the class, though, is also up for debate. Caleb Evans looks like he's trending very well as a starter, and then we'll see how that all works out. But the Andrew Booth Jr. pick and the Ed Ingram pick, Andrew Booth Jr., I think a lot of us are sort of ready to go. I just don't think this is ever going to happen. The too many injuries for one, and then just the fact that he was quickly passed by Mekhi Blackman, who we will absolutely get to as the first team corner. He has not taken Andrew Booth Jr. has not taken a single first team rep all throughout OTA's mini camp, training camp that I've been there for. So not a
Wow.
single one. Yeah. And Ed Ingram is an interesting case because there's expectation that he's going to take the next step. He played a ton of football last year, but you watched the Seattle game and guess who you saw? One starting offensive lineman, which makes you go, okay, well, that's interesting because that doesn't always happen that they just to pick one guy to put out there. And the
Yeah.
explanation was very much like, we love what he's doing in training camp. He's got to do this and this and this and this and this, but we love what he's doing. And those are two others that I'd love your take on, kind of what is maybe has held them back potentially based on their skill sets, and just whether we should believe that there's anything more there.
All right, I'm going to mix in someone who we talked about a lot a couple years ago, Trey Lance, and the roundabout way to get back to Andrew Booth. I really think with Andrew Booth and Trey Lance, and I'm not, giving them crutches and, defending them for any, like, I have no reason to do that. I just think Andrew Booth and Trey Lance have just not played enough football in the last like 2 years. Like he was dinged up at Clemson, couldn't do anything during the pre-draft process, got hurt last year. And I think at corner, like you just mentioned, if you're not playing, you're going to get passed up by someone like, a third round pick in Mekhi Blackman, someone who's ready, who's available, who's played a lot of football recently, who doesn't have to, brush off any rust. And with Ed Ingram, that just goes back. I mean, I'm not going to say that I totally nailed that one, but I think a lot of us thought, hey, this was a very weird fit. And I feel like on that post draft episode in 2022, I was like, why did they pick this big, like heavy footed power blocker in an offense that prioritizes, or we at least thought prioritized, agility and balance on the move? That's just not Ed Ingram's game. So I'm not really surprised about him. And like you mentioned, if he's playing and is the only quote unquote first team offensive lineman on the field in a preseason game, I think they want to see more from him than even what they're saying into the media.
There's no question. And it's hard to figure out with offensive linemen when it's supposed to click in, how long it could be, how long they're supposed to wait. And this is something that the Vikings themselves in the recent past have also struggled to figure out. Like how long do we give this guy that we drafted and hope develops before we just say it's not working? The numbers are what they are from last year. And the early signs of training camp are, I have no idea. I mean, just to tell you the truth, I don't know. How am I supposed to watch a handful of 11 on 11 reps and go, oh, yeah, he's taking the next step? Or no, it's going to be the same
You're not.
problems.
Yeah.
There has been a lot of pressure on Kirk Cousins from Brian Flores' defense, though. I would say that. And I think that, I don't know. If I had to guess, I would say it's probably not going to be a big step forward. But they also have to kind of decide, do we bring in Dalton Risner? Do we make a change here? Do we, bring in somebody else to compete with him? Or do we have somebody waiting in the wings in case this goes bad? And once again, it kind of goes back to there were the signs there that this could be the case. And if Ingram doesn't take the big step, or at least is average, then I think that there is a lot of criticism that is justified from fans about this class. In fact, the funny thing is with Andrew Booth Jr., I actually really liked the pick at the beginning until he said he was always hurt, and then I liked it less. It was like,
Yeah.
I thought that, oh wow, they got a guy who was projected as a mid first round pick in the second, and then oh, the injury history has just come to fruition. But I think with these two, it's pretty easy to say, yeah, I think you could have seen this coming.
Yeah, here's what I'll say on Ed Ingram specifically. If you're like wondering when can this jump happen, like historically, how does it happen for a second or a third rounder, year 2, year 3? When is it? It's usually like the Brian O'Neill cases where the talent is there, the fundamentals are there, the balance, the technique. They just need to get stronger. And I write that, and I probably said it on this podcast a bunch during draft season that like Tristan Wirfs is the one guy that I can really point to say he was what I call NFL strong. And that's a phrase you probably remember from January through April with me. Once he was in college, like he entered the league NFL strong, was able to just hit the ground running. Almost every other, like between even first to third round blocker, it takes them a year to be able to deal with the power that they're going to see on a consistent basis at the NFL level. I don't think that's a problem with Ed Ingram, and that's why I'm a little concerned. It's very rare to suddenly see a big, heavy footed blocker, especially at guard, suddenly become agile and be able to get to those second level blocks with a lot of consistency and be under control and be balanced. So unfortunately for him, it's not just, hey, you just got to get a little bit stronger. It took Brian O'Neill 3 seasons. Then he became an elite right tackle. Christian Darrisaw had all of that, like those things together, needed to get a little stronger and get healthy. Then he was outstanding as well. Ingram, I can't think of a lot of cases where it's, oh, you need to like slim down and maybe lose some of your power so you can be more mobile in this wide zone scheme. So that's where I'm a little concerned about his, chances of a year 2 breakout, because we just don't see that very often going in that direction for a blocker.
The other thing that I heard and my ears perked up was when Wes Phillips, I think it was in minicamp, maybe used the word false step. And anytime I hear that, I go, oh, that's not good, because that's a very hard thing to fix. And maybe you have a better explanation about it than I do. But when you have to go in the NFL, it's like you got to go. There can't be hesitation at all. There can't be, well, you start to just naturally take a step this way and then go. Sort of like if you're hitting a 95-mile-an-hour fastball, you can't have your hands do something first. They just got to get
Mhm.
right to the ball.
Oh,
That's how I think of it. And it's hard to spot for me, like not being an offensive lineman, things like that. But when I hear those words come up, I go, I wonder if that's a thing. And also just recognition is a thing from offensive linemen. And that's where I think if you're going to take that next step for him, if it is possible, it's recognition. It's he can see more of these blitzes and understand them better and know where to be, because I do think that that was one of the biggest issues, is just not recognizing what was coming his way.
yeah, and with that false step point, that's a good one for Wes to bring up. I just think with Ingram, he's not used to doing a lot of what Kevin O'Connell is going to ask of him to get so lateral in such a hurry that, like I said, of course, at LSU, they occasionally ran, inside zone, outside zone. Every run game has that, but it was mostly downhill power running where he could climb to the second level, just getting north south. And that's why he was, widely considered a second, third, fourth round pick in that right scheme. I'm just looking back over here. And this is always a fun game to play, the hindsight, who they could have picked. Bernard Ryman from Central Michigan, who's with the Colts. He plays tackle, a lot more athleticism. There was another one, Dylan Parham from Memphis, kind of the same type, but I thought he had more athleticism. Sean Ryan from UCLA, who went to the Packers later in the third round. So those were all blockers that would have, I think, been better scheme fits. And that's what, why I said coming on that, post-draft episode that I get the idea to address the guard position, but it's not surprising that there's false steps. There's times where he doesn't look like he knows what's coming because it's just moving way too fast for him. He's not used to, handling those same job responsibilities that Kevin O'Connell is asking of him. He just didn't do that in college at LSU.
It just wouldn't be a Vikings show if we didn't spend 20 minutes on the guard, but we're going to move on. Now, what if I told you 30 for 30 music? What if I told you that Ivan Pace won the job over Brian Asamoah and to start next to Jordan Hicks? Now, this has not happened yet. It's not being determined, but Ivan Pace has taken way more first team reps in training camp overall than Brian Asamoah, or especially over the last couple of weeks. And then I thought had a very good game against Seattle,
He
save
did.
for a penalty and maybe one coverage rep, which hurt his PFF grade. But I mean, I thought what you saw was a little wrecking ball. I kind of called him Sonic the Hedgehog because he just like had so much quickness and speed. But then if he beats out Asamoah, you kind of go like, well, wait a minute. What about that 2022 draft pick guy? And there's also the possibility that, Jordan Hicks ends up shockingly getting the axe or something. I don't think that they'll do that, but it just looks like Ivan Pace Jr. throughout training camp is outplaying Asamoah. And I guess the question is, how the heck did this happen with an undrafted free agent?
Yeah, it's a fantastic story. I'm not super surprised. I think if Ivan Pace was even 5'11" or 6 foot and 230 pounds, no way he goes undrafted, because the 5'10", I think, probably scared away some teams. But on film, I think this is kind of a way to discuss how traits kind of translate to the next level and how they're functional on the football field. I think the fact, this might sound crazy, but that he's 5'10" actually helps him in the leverage game. That when those guards get up to him, he's underneath their pad. There's no way that, yes, at times a bigger blocker will be able to just shove him out of the way or drive him out of the running lane. But a lot of times he was so good stacking and shedding at Cincinnati, and before that at Miami of Ohio, because he wins the leverage battle every single time because he's built so low to the ground. Beyond that, he's very willing. Like, he's someone that in the box, when he's attacking downhill or even getting outside, scraping to an outside run, he understands, hey, look, this is going to be a pretty violent play that I have to kind of do here, but he's going to get up and into those blockers before they can get to him. So I think he's playing a lot like he did at Cincinnati. I think he's useful as a blitzer. And I saw him in coverage at Cincinnati and thought, okay, this is not Eric Kendricks 2.0, but it's someone that is not just, hey, I'm going to be downhill, I'm going to be super aggressive. He understood route concepts behind him pretty well. And he's kind of like the same size as a lot of running backs who are, around 5'10", 220, 230 pounds. So it's certainly a little surprising because he's an undrafted rookie beating out, day 2 pick in Brian Asamoah. But based on their film from Oklahoma and Cincinnati, I don't think they're drastically different players, different measurables. But in terms of traits, I think you would look at Ivan Pace and say, hey, if he's 6 foot, 225, he's probably a 3rd or a 4th round pick as well. So I think people got hung up on the lack of height. And maybe there'll be times where throws down the seam can, be thrown over his head because he just isn't that tall. But in terms of like what you want a linebacker to do, stacking and shedding, covering well, man coverage, sinking in zone, not being sucked up by play action, I thought he was a very refined linebacker coming into this draft. So it's not crazy surprising given just the type of polished player he was as a prospect.
It was also brought up on the broadcast that they had him call the defense in the game, which makes you immediately perk up to, oh, does this guy get it? Because if he
Yeah.
does, then all of that stuff can happen. And to me, we were talking about how Lewis Cine did not look twitchy. Ivan Pace looked very twitchy. I mean, he looked like he was
Yeah.
just wherever he was going full speed. And Jordan Hicks said this to me one time. He said, if I'm wrong, I'd rather be wrong going full speed than if I'm just, trying to be hesitant, because then I'm going to get beat either way. And I thought that
And that's
makes a
Ivan
lot of
Pace.
sense. Yeah, that makes a lot
Yeah.
of sense.
That's Ivan
Did
Pace
you,
too.
where did you have him coming out? Did you have him as a draft pick?
Yeah, I had him in the 7th round, which now, I mean, even one preseason game in, and I've read all the buzz from camp. It seems kind of silly. Maybe I got a little bit caught up on the lack of size as well. But again, this was a very polished player coming out. His athleticism wasn't through the roof. I was thinking a little bit kind of concerned about that at the next level. But if you can keep him mostly in the box, attacking downhill. And when I say attacking, I mean attacking. He's going to attack blocks because he knows, kind of to your point there about what Jordan Hicks told you, if he's hesitant at all, he's going to get engulfed and just completely overwhelmed, pushed out of the play. He never does that. And I think there with Brian Flores and that what we know about the scheme that it is going to be very blitz heavy with safeties and linebackers. He's very good in that regard because of that tenacity that he plays with.
Um, so I guess we're moving to the 2023 class with that. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's looking like it's going to have a huge impact here, Chris,
Mm-hmm.
because Jordan Addison early returns, what he did in the preseason game. Sometimes for me as a reporter, I will say this: when you're watching practice all the time and you're trying to relate to the outside world, and then they get to see it, the people who haven't visited camp and they're just reading what we're saying or watching the show or listening to the show. It's rewarding. It's like, see, we've been saying that's what's going on. That diving catch out of bounds. And I actually thought the other one needed some contorting as well to kind of adjust to
Mm-hmm.
a
It
not a
did.
great football from Nick Mullins. And it was like, that's the what, that's it. That's it. Like the DiCaprio meme. Like, there it is. Uh, where should we set the expectations, though? This is a constant debate on the sidelines with reporters, and I'm sure that fans are wondering this too, because I still think that KJ Osborne, who's had a phenomenal training camp and offseason, is going to be their number two wide receiver to start. But when you see raw talent like this making special plays and special catches, that's how you get on the field. It's really just a matter of blocking, which is a big deal in this system. And it's also a matter of, can you really get down the details? Because Kevin O'Connell does not make it easy on his wide receivers. So I think there will be an adjustment period. But it seems to me like everything that Jordan Addison was billed as is coming to fruition in training camp and now preseason.
Yeah, we certainly saw it in the preseason game. And one note about that deep over that he caught, and I don't know if this was a wrinkle that Kevin O'Connell or the wide receiver coach asked of him, but he didn't just like run a rounded deep over. He kind of like sold that he was going to go vertical, and that safety sunk back. He almost made himself more open. I think either way, he was going to be open based on like the zone coverage that the back end players were in. But selling it a little bit that he was going deep really opened up a huge hole for the quarterback to throw him the football. Those are the little things that you're talking about that he did so well at Pittsburgh early in his career and at USC last year. And I think you're probably right that the safe bet is, hey, they're going to go with the veteran that they know that's in the system that produced last year in KJ Osborne to start. But I really think it'll be probably by October that Jordan Addison is second in the pecking order in terms of targets. Now, in terms of expectations, I think you would be probably better to answer that than me, because it's like there's Justin Jefferson, obviously, as the elephant in the room, and Kevin O'Connell and the Shanahan system's pedigree of just highlighting a number one receiver. And it's like, okay, I think I read some, hey, like there's going to be a lot of rolled coverage to Justin Jefferson. This is going to leave Jordan Addison wide open. But it almost feels like it doesn't matter if there's rolled coverage to Justin Jefferson. He's still going to get his targets and his catches and his touchdowns and his receiving yards. So it's very difficult to pinpoint, what Jordan Addison's production could be this season. But I certainly think, even though he's a relatively younger prospect, he's capable of being that hit the ground running number two wide receiver, because I think this is an offense that's not necessarily predicated on yards after the catch, but intricacy as a route runner. And like you mentioned, doing the little things very well. And I think that is where he thrives. He's not going to create a ton after the catch, but he's going to get open with good regularity. And I think that's more important than anything else in today's NFL.
Yeah, it's a great observation. And this time around, I get to be the guy who goes, if it works out the way that it's going so far, I get to be the one who's like, see, I said way back in March they should
You did
draft
that draft
Jordan
sim.
Addison.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. That was my first draft sim was Jordan Addison. But
Yes.
my reasoning on it, and it's not. I mean, I'm not patting myself on the back because I've certainly been wrong enough times. But I think route running is just the ball game. Route running and ball tracking, and that's how you win. You guys who track the ball well and run great routes, they're going to give you the best chance to succeed. And anybody can bust, but I'm going to put my bets on those guys. And that's what Jordan Addison was. And his ball tracking and his body control and making plays along the sidelines, difficult catches, it's all been there. And I think the expectations because of this training camp should be very, very high. Now, Mekhi Blackman was a debated draft pick when it happened because of consensus boards. And we've been over that whole consensus board thing. But starting Did you think that he would be a starter right away? How did you feel about him coming out, and where should we set the bar for him?
I didn't think he'd be starting this early. Like, if you're telling me that Andrew Booth has not played one first team rep over Mekhi Blackmon in camp, and then in the preseason game, I thought Blackmon was very good. I wasn't seeing him being that instant impact starter, like right, like opposite the number one corner. But based on how pesky he was at the line of scrimmage, and like you just mentioned, it's kind of a mirrored position, obviously, wide receiver and corner. I'm a big proponent of, did a cornerback get his hands on a lot of footballs in college? Was he breaking up a lot of passes? And certainly Blackmon did that at USC. I was a little concerned about his spindly frame, and I think like we saw with the penalty in the game, that he is going to be overly grabby, and there are going to be some bigger wide receivers, and not even just like Mike Evans, 6'5", 230, like even like the 6', 6'1", 200-pound receivers are very strong in their upper half, beating press at the line of scrimmage, dealing with physicality throughout the route. That's where he could struggle a little bit because he is so spindly. But in terms of just having instincts, even on the touchdown that he was in tight coverage, he was right there. Like, that was a ridiculous throw from Drew Lock. He almost didn't realize a throw was even going to be made because he was in so tight on that. I just think he's really one of those natural sticky corners that usually has good awareness. He didn't on that play necessarily. When the ball is arriving, I was seeing him as someone that could be a contributor in year one. I just didn't think it would happen early on, even before the regular season started.
And I think, we were talking about Ivan Pace and just his physical nature. And I mean, it's football, man. So, like, this guy gets in people's faces, Mekhi Blackmon, and he's going to play physical, and it's going to cause some penalties at first. There's no question about it. I mean, even where I was very impressed on one route that was overthrown by Drew Lock, I saw him putting some hands on the receiver a little bit farther down the field, and maybe you could get penalized for that. But at the same time, it's, what is the saying? It's easier to say whoa than go. I mean, the fact is that he wants to get in people's faces and play physically. And also, welcome to the NFL, where a backup quarterback can make that throw for a touchdown
Yeah, good
against
call.
him. There you go. That's the league for you, man. So I think there's going to be a learning curve. But when you kind of have this natural, like you said, stickiness, that's a great starting point. And then if you've impressed Brian Flores enough to be on the field, they haven't gone out and gotten another defensive back who's a veteran or anything like that. I think that that really speaks well of his game. And gosh, it just feels so much different talking about one draft class versus the other, because it's the first half of our show is, man, it's just all, and then it's like, wow, look at these guys.
Yeah, so perfect segue too from Ivan Pace to Blackmon, and that you just kind of said it. They're both attackers. Like, they understand I'm smaller. I mean, with Pace is that he's short, he doesn't have long arms. With Blackmon, he understands he's not 210 pounds. Not that you need to be that heavy at corner, but he's pretty spindly. You can see it on film. I don't remember exactly what he was weight wise coming out, but he was just looked spindly on film. That helps them, that they don't shy away from it. They play bigger than their size because they are not timid out there whatsoever. And I think if you're going to make it, whether it be a third round pick or a rookie undrafted free agent that has those size deficiencies, you have to just lean into it and say, look, I know I'm small, so I'm going to attack. So I think that really plays well for both of them. And yes, it does kind of seem like night and day between 2022 and 2023. I do want to mention, though, Luigi Villain looked very good, undrafted free agent. I loved him. I think I had like a top 125 grade on him in 2022. Very slippery player. I know it was, against backups, of course. It wasn't against Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas, those two rookies from last year on the edge for Seattle who were really good. But he just kind of looks like he did at Wake Forest in that final season after transferring from Michigan, that he's like almost in a way like Pace and like Blackmon, where he's just naturally like good at his job. He's slippery. There's not a lot of things that you can look at on a mock draftable web or, just in terms of measurables, but he just understands how to use his hands with those swipe moves and how to just continue to hustle throughout a play to get the strip sack late on that outside rush that didn't win initially. So he's one that I remember bringing him up like late in the episode after 2022 post draft to say, Luigi Villain might be someone that looks like that inside outside rusher because of his bigger frame that has good handwork who could maybe start in the practice squad and then maybe by year 2 or year 3 become that good situational player. It's still relatively early, but I think it was a good start for him against the Seahawks.
And he was on the 53 last year after a great preseason, and then he comes out and does it again. I even
Mm-hmm.
wonder, and I don't want to be definitive about this, but I wonder if he would be behind DJ Wanham in their rotation and not Patrick Jones, at least who's
Mm.
played better in the preseason game and training camp. It's Luigi Villain. And I think what Brian Flores has shown very clearly is he does not care where you were drafted. I think most coaches don't, but he really hasn't because the 2022 class has first and second round picks sitting and undrafted free agents and
Mhm.
third round and undrafted free agents playing. So it's clear. I think that he's going to do that, which is really good. And I think that there's a lot of guys who are fits for Brian Flores that maybe they drafted when it was a different type of defense that aren't as good of fits. I'm sure you have a thousand more things to say about these draft classes, but we this is not draft season. We don't need to make this an hour and 20-minute epic as we have so many times. So let me just allow you to live your life a little here and ask you this. Who has impressed you from the top of the draft class of 2023? Anthony Richardson named a starter. Shocker. Bryce Young named a starter. Total shocker. But maybe what have been some of your observations on those guys?
Yeah. So one player who we talked about a lot, I remember talking about him pre-workout at the combine. Deonte Banks of the Giants was someone that I think a lot of Vikings fans thought, hey, if they want to go corner, he could be someone that they could pick. Had a pair of pass breakups in his preseason debut. He just feels like that perfect press man corner for Wink Martindale's system with the Giants. And then Felix Anudike-Uzomah, who is another one that we discussed. If the Vikings did want to go edge rusher in the first round, had 3 pressures against the Saints. Just watched him last night, and it's kind of funny. I was on One Bills Live, which is like a daily Bills show here in Buffalo, and we had Greg Cosell on, and what he said he does for these preseason games is look to see if rookies are playing like they did in college. Are they playing as fast? We talked about that with Lewis Cine. I don't think he was playing as fast as he did, whether it was mental or physical. Felix Anudike-Uzomah and Deonte Banks, like it didn't look like they were wearing a different helmet. Like they looked like they were at Maryland and Kansas State. The outside speed rush for Anudike-Uzomah was really good. The Chiefs need a secondary rusher opposite Chris Jones. So really, none of the quarterbacks were like, wow, like what a start. I mean, Anthony Richardson, beyond the pick, I think played the best of the 3. But those 2 defensive players, I thought, not only were they good fits schematically, they're what those teams needed in the Giants and the Kansas City Chiefs. And they really hit the ground running with their first preseason start, making some plays in coverage and as a pass rusher.
I did notice Anthony Richardson run directly into the chest of a linebacker, and I was just like, that looks like Dante Culpepper to me, where you expect the quarterback to just kind of go out of bounds or slide, and he probably should learn to slide, but very Josh Allen like, where the
Mm-hmm.
linebacker's like, okay, it's the quarterback, I'm going to tackle. Oh no, he's coming for you. He's targeting you. You're not targeting him, which I think that Richardson, everyone's going to talk about how raw he is. We're going to see that throughout the season. There's going to be some bad throws, as there always are for rookies. But one of the things I look for with these quarterbacks and a preseason, so I didn't watch a lot. I just wanted to see a little Anthony Richardson. But how in command do you look? And I thought
Yeah.
of the quarterbacks, the most in command looked like it was Anthony Richardson. Just even
Yeah.
body language, walk up. This is my football team.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I kind of had the same takeaway. I watched all 3 of them. I thought Bryce Young looked the least in command, and he was under duress. I don't know if it was the full Carolina Panthers offensive line, but they weren't necessarily facing Quinnen Williams and company, but it was Jermaine Johnson, who was a first round pick last year, Will McDonald, who was the 15th overall pick this year. Just looked like, I don't know, like this is going to sound silly, but he just looked small. His arm did not look very live, and he looked a little timid, like, oh, I'm just going to throw it into the flat here and then take a big shot. Richardson throws the pick on the first drive, and then like later has a couple nice throws over the middle. Didn't look scared, like you mentioned, just running into corners and linebackers at the next level, popping right back up. He had a really good throw from about the 20 or 30-yard line to the front corner of the pylon that should have been a touchdown. Alec Pierce couldn't reel it in. he looked more in command. CJ Stroud certainly had his struggles as well, than the two who were kind of billed as the more pro-ready passers because of experience, and it was relatively justified, I think. But Bryce Young, to me, that was kind of my concern with him and why he was my quarterback 3. Just the physical traits are not there with him. Like everything with him, if he does succeed, is going to be because he understands where to go with the football in a hurry, pre-snap, post-snap, faster than the others. But in a first preseason game where you're obviously not game planning, you're not doing, scripting the first 15 plays necessarily. I'm not sure if the Panthers did that. He just looked like, oh, that's the number 1 overall pick, like throwing quick throws into the flat and taking big shots. Like I was a little concerned watching Bryce Young, and I came away with the same thoughts about Anthony Richardson being in a lot more of a command of the offense after only 13 starts in college than I was expecting.
Okay, last thing. Because Anthony Richardson is I'm going to ride that roller coaster wherever it takes me. And I decided that probably after the first time I saw him against Utah, I was like the Dave Gettleman where I saw like 5 plays against Utah. I was like, that's my guy. I'm gonna go wherever he goes. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But those physical traits are so preposterous that I'm gonna take my shot. So he was my QB1. We'll see how that works out.
Mine too.
Obviously this does not determine it, this preseason game. But I just thought, well, okay, looks like he's in command. Now give me the late rounder who you were dying on their hill throughout draft season, because I got one for me. And you see him a little in preseason, you go, I knew it. I knew it. That guy, A.T. Perry is my guy. I saw A.T. Perry catching a
Ooh,
bunch of passes, and I was
he
like, I
did.
knew
The
it.
Saints
I
looked
knew it.
good
That's my guy.
offensively. Yeah.
You know who else? I'm sure a bunch of Vikings fans. Dorian Thompson Robinson is probably another guy who's played extremely well. And again, it's preseason, it's not predictive, but he has played. I mean, way better than Jaron Hall played, of course. And I think that there was a report that the Vikings were thinking about taking Thompson Robinson, but he was taken earlier. Whatever, it doesn't matter.
Mm.
He's probably a guy that a lot of Vikings fans were like, I thought he could be pretty good. Look at him out there.
Yeah, I'm trying to. There's so many that are running through my head. Honestly, Dwayne McBride was one of them. I know I mentioned him on the post draft episode that we did. Had a couple nice runs. At first, looked a little shaky, like he wasn't sure which hole to hit. But then after he got a few more carries with the Vikings, I think he looked like who I saw at UAB. Had a nice. I think there was a pitch out where he looked explosive, made multiple cuts, made some defenders miss, picked up 6 or 7 yards. He was really one that I was banging the table for after the draft. I was actually down in Fort Lauderdale at the CBS Sports headquarters, and they had me on, like, I think their like main fantasy podcast afterward, like, hey, who are some late round running backs? And I was like, ding, 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 Dwayne McBride, 7th rounder. That was before Devin Cook was released, but then it felt like he was probably going to get traded or released. So he sticks out. I'm just looking at the
How about
board
I've
right.
got another one that I liked for no particular reason, but Rashawn Johnson from the Bears, the guy out of who
Oh,
Bijan Robinson's backup. I remember thinking when the first time I saw Texas, I was like, "Oh, this must be Bijan Robinson, the guy they're talking about." I'm like, no, actually,
yeah.
that's his backup. And so I saw that he had a pretty good game. Aiden O'Connell was a quarterback, kind of liked him out of Purdue, that I thought looked pretty good
Mhm.
in the preseason. I think it's part of the fun is to talk about
I
guys
love
that
it.
were 5th
It's so
rounders or
much fun.
something.
It's like so I'm not going to say that I'm like super nerdy and I'm like watching the fourth quarter of every preseason game. I'll like turn it on. Oh, hey, look, it's Thursday night. I'll put on this game. And then like a few minutes in, I'm like, all right, this is boring. And then like I'll hear a name like that where I'll hear, oh, that was a nice run by Roshan Johnson. I'm like, oh yeah, Roshan Johnson's in this game probably right now. One other name that I'll bring up, Ronnie Bell of the 49ers, went in the 7th round. I'm like enamored by, I guess it's John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan, and like kind of running that draft room, finding these awesome yards after the catch players. Because for as much as I'll admit, and I agree with you that separation ability at receiver is more important than anything else, the 49ers and the Chiefs and the Bengals, I think part of why they've become so dynamic offensively, they're so awesome after the catch with Debo and Brandon Ayuk and Curtis Samuel and Jamar Chase. Even Jawan Jennings, who was a 7th round pick, I believe in 2020, was this big, like not athletic former quarterback who was just like a moose in the open field. Ronnie Bell made a couple nice catches and had a jet sweep where he, made like 3 or 4 defenders miss in that first preseason game. So Ronnie Bell is someone at Michigan that I thought, hey, this guy should be picked before the 7th round. The 49ers of all teams picked him. He was very good after the catch in the Big Ten. So he was someone that I was watching that game late, what was it, Sunday, and I was like, oh, Ronnie Bell, holy crap. Like I forgot about him from those months where you're inundated with all these players. Then you're like, you kind of forget about him in the summer, you're golfing, you're doing other stuff. And then it's like, oh yeah, let's watch Ronnie Bell in the fourth quarter make some plays. So there's plenty of them around the league. We could have another 30 minutes where I could rattle some of these off. We could go back and forth, but he and Dwayne McBride would probably be my two favorites that went in the 7th round, who I think can be good players relatively early in their careers.
Yeah, I'll admit. So I said like, "Oh, I don't really watch these preseason games or whatever." But then this guy, and did you see that guy and that guy? Okay,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I was watching. Chris
Yeah.
Trapasso, you're the best man. This was great analysis and insight into what we've seen from these draft classes. And of course, you will not be a stranger around the show throughout the season as we consistently check in on how things are going. And we've also got unproven quarterbacks in the division, controversial draft in Detroit. This could have gone on much longer. And so we will pick it up another time very soon. Thanks so much. And great to connect with you again, man.
Sure thing. Thanks, Matt.